Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new Sunday edition of your weekday programme, The Daily Debate, here on your Nile TV International. I'm your host, Nancy Sarah Barakat. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's tour of Asia, which began on Friday and ends on Wednesday. During his tour, President el-Sisi visited Kazakhstan, where he met with his Kazakh counterpart in talks that saw him state Egypt's keenness on strengthening economic and bilateral cooperation. Both presidents also discussed means of fighting terrorism and renewing religious discourse. President el-Sisi has also arrived since then to Japan, where he will be giving a speech before the Japanese parliament. Japanese diplomats are describing the speech as an historic moment, with el-Sisi, the first Arab president, among only a few other world leaders to deliver a speech before Japan's parliament. The president will end his tour of Asia with a visit to South Korea, where he will meet with his South Korean counterpart. This tour is considered President el-Sisi's second Asian one, after visiting Singapore and Indonesia in August of 2015 and China back in 2014. And in light of the economic prospect that this tour holds, we'll also be reviewing the recent activities and achievements accomplished by the Ministry of International Cooperation, headed by Minister Sahar Nasr. That's going to be on the second part of our program. Now, the ministry is scheduled to hold an international cooperation meeting in May, where all the countries interested in sustainable development goals will be invited. The announcement was made as the United Nations celebrated the 50th year of the United Nations for Development Programme, the UNDP. We'll also be tackling the recent agreements that were signed by the ministry with banks like the AIIB and the African Development Bank in the fields of development and supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, just how significant is President el-Sisi's tour of Asia? What are some of the most important outcomes that we should expect? What is the importance of President el-Sisi's address to the Japanese Parliament? How do we evaluate the overall economic performance during the past couple of months for this new government, and in particular the Ministry of International Cooperation? That and much more coming up on the program. But as usual, we like to shed more light on some of the stories making headlines. And as we all know, anti-government rebels and Russia have both reported breaches of the fragile truce in Syria. Now in its second day, Russian planes have attacked several sites in northern Syria, according to activists. Russia has not confirmed any sorties on Sunday and says it has also identified 9 breaches of the truce. A cessation of hostilities was agreed as part of a US-Russian plan. Russia says that in general it is the first major cessation of hostilities in the 5 years of war. More than 250,000 people have been killed in the fighting against President Bashar al-Assad. Millions more have been forced from their homes. Humanitarian agencies are hoping the use of the truce to deliver aid to besieged areas of the country. And for some more insights and analysis of the truce in Syria, I'm being joined now over the phone by Ambassador Nabil Badr, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much.
Let me start off by asking you what you make of this temporary ceasefire, and do you think it's going to hold?
Well, my understanding, as a matter of fact, that since the agreement was concluded between the Secretary of State Kerry and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, it has been maintained, as has been announced at that time, that the ceasefire will hold. But Russia expressed at that time that it will continue targets against Daesh or against al-Nusra in particular, because it considers al-Nusra as a terrorist organization. al-Nusra in particular, I think the Russians have a special sensitivity to that organization, which is termed to be terrorist, because of their action. That's number one. And because, as a matter of fact, my understanding is that the formation of al-Nusra groups and militias fighting in Syria come basically from some of the Islamic states within Russia itself, Dagestan, Chechen, etc., etc., and that they are supported. They get supported from some regional powers here, but Russia considers that a matter of national security, that these people go to Syria, will claim they are fighting for the Syrian cause. At the same time, they get training, they get money, and they get a better standing, and accordingly might return and cause real dangers there. So I think that the agreement on the ceasefire will hold, because that exception was stipulated since the beginning.
Right.
I hope it does not exceed or go to more or a wider range.
But let me ask you this, Ambassador Nabil. The fact that Daesh and al-Nusra are not involved in the ceasefire, what implications could this have?
Well, the implication is that as much as coordination is efficient between the two powers that agreed on starting this process, namely the United States and Russia, and as careful as they should be in the follow-up of the implementation of the agreement, that will be quite important. In other words, the logic of that phase is they should not give a chance to powers that would like the whole ceasefire to come to an end and to restart hostilities and spoil the whole process.
Right.
So there must be a very careful understanding, very careful follow-up, and a degree of clearness which can address the public opinion in Syria and outside Syria to stop forces that have no interest in seeing a real ceasefire take place or a real political process hopefully underway.
Okay, I thank you very much for your insights, Ambassador Nabil Badr, former Assistant Foreign Minister. Our second stop story, and spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Councillor Ahmed Abu Zaid, said President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has put forward the name of a powerful Egyptian candidate with a diplomatic background to fill the post of the Arab League chief. The ministry added that high-level negotiations are underway to support the candidate, whose name will be announced within the upcoming days. The announcement came after Arab League chief Nabil al-Arabi said on Sunday he would not seek a second term as Secretary General after his present term ends in July. Arabi, who is now 80, took the head or the helm of the chief of the Arab League following fellow diplomat Amr Moussa back in 2011. He has served as foreign minister in the government that came to power after the ouster of Hosni Mubarak. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's all the top stories I have for you for now. Let's take a look at the first report that we have for you tonight, and a closer look at President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's tour of Asia. I also would like to add that during his visit to Tokyo, the President will witness tomorrow the signature ceremony between government and Japan International Cooperation Agency to receive soft loans for financing certain projects in Egypt. An official agency has told reporters the value of these soft loans are worth at least 450 to 455 million US dollars. Let's take a look at the following report.
President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi began on Friday an Asian tour that will include Kazakhstan, Japan and South Korea. This is President al-Sisi's second Asian tour after visiting Singapore and Indonesia in August 2015 and China in late 2014. In Kazakhstan, the President said that Egypt and Kazakhstan are keen on strengthening bilateral economic and commercial relations and especially boosting cooperation in the developmental sectors. During a press conference on Friday with Kazakhstan President Nursultan Nazarbayev, al-Sisi stressed on the sectors of education, agriculture, tourism and trade as domains of development projects. He added that cooperation between the two countries in fighting terrorism, extremism and correcting the religious discourse are considered one of the most important fields of cooperation. President el-Sisi also assured that relations between Egypt and Kazakhstan are special and that both countries care about consolidating and developing relations to wider scopes, especially on the economic and trade levels to benefit mutual interests. Both presidents also discussed pressing regional and international matters. On Monday, President el-Sisi is set to give a speech in front of the Japanese parliament. Japanese diplomatic sources have deemed the speech historic, with el-Sisi the first Arab president among only a few other world leaders to deliver a speech in front of the Japanese parliament. President el-Sisi was also scheduled to meet with senior officials during his visit to Tokyo. That will start Sunday evening. He will meet with the head of the Japan International Cooperation Agency as well as Tokyo's governor. The president will meet also Japanese Prime Minister and Japanese Emperor. President el-Sisi will also hold a meeting with Japanese businessmen and will attend an economic forum organized by the Egyptian-Japanese Business Council. The president will end his Asian tour in South Korea, where he will meet South Korean President and South Korean Prime Minister as well as head of the South Korean Parliament. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi will also meet representatives and CEOs of South Korean corporations in addition to attending a meeting of the Egyptian-Korean Business Council.
بأجيال قوية أحقق أمانيكي
بإيدي أبنيكي أجتهد لأعطيكي أخضر أراضيكي
محلاها عشت فلاح مطمن قلبه مرتاح
أبهر العالم بيكي
جميلة بكل ما فيكي بدمي أحميكي
And a very warm welcome back. Allow me to welcome here in the studio Mr. Ashraf Naguib, Secretary General of the Egyptian Asian Business Council. Thank you very much for coming in tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Mr. Ned Al-Khidri, Economic Analyst. Thank you very much for coming in. Mr. Ned, let me start off with yourself, and just if you could give me your overall impressions, first of all, of the President's tour of Asia, and if you see any significance as well to its timing.
Of course, the tour of Asia that the President is doing now has a great significance, especially in that time, as overall the globe is witnessing a slowdown in its growth and are fearing more and more slowdowns in their economic performances.
Right.
So accordingly, we have to think out of the box. We have to fetch our new markets for ourselves. So we could continue producing, continue exporting, continue having tourists, continue opening new allies in new countries. The Asian and the African side has been moderately looked at during the past 2 decades.
Right.
You can say the European Union was in its boom. You can say the issue of Palestine and the Gulf and the oil and the involvement of the U.S. and the Western powers in it. You can say many things.
Right.
But since 2006, the Egyptian administration started, before even the upheavals of 2011 and the revolution of 30th of June, they started looking away from the Western powers.
Right.
So they started to look for new markets. They started to look for the expected growth tigers to be during the coming period. With all the slowdown and with all this financial crisis that has been happening during the past decade, Asia and especially China, India, and some other small countries have recorded slightly even a two-digit growth or a little bit below a two-digit growth.
Right.
So they represent a very big markets. We need their stuff. We need their knowledge. We need their know-how, and they need our expertise, and they need our capabilities, and they need also our strategic position as a trading hub in the middle of the world.
Right. I'll put the same question to you, Mr. Ashraf, and your impressions once again of the President's tour of Asia.
Well, this is, I believe, the third time that he's toured Asia since he has been elected to the presidency, and I think that gives us a quite significant indicator of how important that side of the world is.
Right.
But it's not just about Asia. We are part of the global community, and we have to reach out to all our partners around the world, those that we have, in a sense, neglected in the past probably decade or so, as Nader was saying, or the past maybe 2 decades. But the importance here is really not just about the tour, but about the countries that he is visiting, specifically being Kazakhstan. He's in Japan now and off to South Korea. And then the intentions behind these visits, they're extremely strategic. They're not just political directed visits, but they're also built on an economic development idea.
Please expand on that, because in particular a lot of people have been asking, what is the significance of visiting Kazakhstan?
No, there's a very big strategic significance to it. I mean, if we're looking at our economic ties with Kazakhstan, we're talking about probably our trade doesn't exceed $50 million. So that is pretty low in a sense. But Kazakhstan is a very strong exporter of wheat and grain, and Egypt being one of the largest, if not the largest exporter of that specific strategic commodity. It kind of makes sense on a very strategic level that we do engage them in terms of securing future crops from that specific strategic commodity. Now, that is not because we are having trouble now, but there is a very big volatility of such products. And hence, yes, it is extremely significant. The second thing that we can start looking at is the growth of Kazakhstan. It is a growing nation, a very fast-paced growing nation. And it basically ranks somewhere in the 50s on the Global Competitiveness Index, which shows we rank 116. So that is, again, a very strong indicator that that country is growing fast. It is a strong economy. It has a lot of natural resources that we can, in a sense, take advantage of partnerships between us. But the real significance of finding Kazakhstani investments coming to Egypt through this visit would be sort of being misled, in a sense. We want to secure very strategic issues that we have with Kazakhstan, and that's why it was important for him to be there.
Right. What do you think are going to be some of the most important outcomes of this tour?
Well, again, we have to separate the countries from each other, and each country has its own different approach and its own strategic context within our overall economic and global strategy. And hence, Japan is very, very different than Kazakhstan, and what we're looking for from South Korea will obviously be different from what we are seeking from Japan. So if we can put Kazakhstan aside now and understand that strategic objective that we have from our bilateral relations, we can move on to Japan. Now, Japan is a completely different ballgame, a country that is number 6 on the Global Competitiveness Index. So, I mean, the space and that distance in terms of our performance globally in terms of competitiveness is really, really big. Now, Japan, we cannot just look at them as being a great superpower today. As a result of what happened post-2000, the World War II. They were a superpower before that as well. So they were able to reconstruct their country on a completely different basis. About 127 million people live in over, I believe, about 300,000 kilometers squared of land, which means that Japan can fit into Egypt about 3 times in terms of size. And Egypt can fit 1 and a bit times into Japan in terms of population. But look at so this shows that, you know, population, having a big population is not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, if it was, you know, used in sense and developed as the Japanese have done. And one of the things that the president is very much focused on, if you look at a lot of the headlines, he talks about economic relations with Japan, but also talks about the education. And one of his statements, I believe, is to send 100,000 Egyptians to study in Japan. I don't know if that's a fantastic idea or not, or if they're going to come back after that, because we have 25% of our PhD students that travel abroad to study don't come back. So, you know, we need to replicate that idea here in Egypt, but we cannot do that unless there's an absolute holistic change in the whole mentality and culture in our education system. So the cultural exchange, the experience and knowledge that we can gain from their systems, not just of education, but education is the key. The way they work, the culture itself, there's a lot of things that we can actually gain out of experience there.
Right. If I come back to you, Mr. Nedal, and ask you perhaps the same question as well, and what are your insights towards the 3 different blocks? Do you think there's something to be gained out of the 3 different countries?
Of course. As Mr. Ashraf was saying, each country has its different culture, has its different type of economy, different basis and ideologicals. As Kazakhstan, as Mr. Ashraf elaborated, the strategic element there, the security of a very strategic course for us. Also, a very large population uses many products of what we produce, many raw materials we could benefit out of that. Japan has a very advanced know-how industry, so we need that. Have a very advanced educational system, we need it. In return, they need a strategic alliance in the Middle East. They need to make their presence here with a very strong alliance.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned that it's a two-way sort of benefit for both countries, because a lot of people will try and say, well, Egypt is going for its own benefit, but there is also a benefit for the other countries to be cooperating with Egypt.
No one would help you or give you the ability for a bilateral trade unless he benefits from it. A win-win game is always the solution for a very good diplomatic relations. Unless you do it, you won't have any of what you want. This is how it was played with Russia, and we were a little bit away of succession after what happened in the airplane of Sharm Sheikh, but we managed to pass over it, and we started strengthening our bilateral relations again. Japan needs, as a member of the G8 and the G20, to have its presence besides the EU, so it could have some influence for the international decision, especially with the oil conflicts going around, especially in west of Russia and the east of Europe, what represents a high demand place for the gas and the natural resources there. Accordingly, South Korea and the conflict there, and what North Korea does from time to time, representing a very important conflict overall the globe. They need their presence also, and they need a very strong ally for them, especially when we are having our seat in the Security Council of the UN. all this to be considered two-way beneficiaries for both sides. It's a win-win game, as I was saying. South Korea has its needs from locating some of their investments in the international hubs that's meant to be in the South Canal Corridor or in east of the Tafriya Canal or East Port Said. All this to be done. In addition to this, having in sight the intentions of Egypt to be the trading hub for the whole Africa, being the gate for Africa, what was discussed during the conference that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh earlier this week.
Right. The President is currently in Japan, and I understand that tomorrow we're supposed to be witnessing the ceremony between the government and the Japan International Cooperation Agency to get soft loans for financing the certain projects here in the country.
Exactly.
Could you expand a little bit about that? What is a soft loan and how would it help these certain industries?
A soft loan is a tool of financing that is being used in infrastructure projects, especially between governments, being eased in its conditions for repayment, having some sort of soft interest or some sort of soft payback returns that could be managed from the returns of the projects that could be done by this proceeds. And by the way, this is not the first soft loan or the first soft loans that we use.
Right.
We have used it before from the French government in our Cairo subway, our Cairo metro system that was built during the 80s, and also from the Japanese before in the second line of the subway in Egypt. And all these projects are mainly meant to be developer infrastructure projects.
Right.
As was the President saying in his speech 2 days ago, unless there is a good infrastructure, no good investor would come and intend to invest in Egypt and to help them and to help himself to have good returns.
Right. Mr. Ashraf, if I come back to you, obviously there's more to this visit, particularly to Japan, than just the economic aspect. We're going to be seeing the President address the Japanese Parliament, perhaps the first Arab leader to do so. How significant will this particular event be, do you think?
Well, it is historical under all circumstances. There's no doubt about it, but it's about what we're going to be saying and what the President is going to be saying. And I think, again, we have very strong political ties with Japan, so this is not really enhancing our political ties. It is specifically for economic reasons, and it is specifically for what we call innovation reasons, where we would like to emulate a bit of this experience that the Japanese have that has put them on this global scale of high-tech manufacturing and industries, and a completely different culture than what we have here in Egypt in a sense. Now, we don't want the culture per se, but we want the experience. Now, when we're looking at the economic aspect of things, we're not going seeking investments at this point.
Right.
And we're not also going to see a lot of investments coming from the private sector. Now, people have this misconception, and I'll try and clear up for everyone again, over and over again, that it is not the countries that make the investments into Egypt.
Right.
There is no such thing as Japan is investing in Egypt. There is a private sector that invests, that is supported by the political decision of a nation.
Right.
Okay, so hence there are two aspects of the strip, and one of them is the soft loans, where the Egyptian government is seeking investments for itself through these specific loans, trying, of course, to avoid loans from the World Bank and the IMF that come with bigger price tags than what would happen with an organization like JICA. So hence we are going to borrow about $89 million for 2 plants, solar power.
Right.
One of them will be about 20 megawatts, and the other one will be a storage facility for 30 megawatts. Now, here comes the mutual benefit, the win-win situation that Nader was talking about, whereby there is a Japanese national strategy that their solar energy companies start raising revenues of about 500 billion yens by 2020.
Right.
Now, hence, this money will be going to Japanese companies that will be building these facilities on Egyptian ground. But the result here is that we will be able to maybe fight a little bit of unemployment by having some labor working with them. But this cannot be what we call sustainable employment, because at the end of the day, the solar plant does not need high labor intensity for it to work.
Right.
But, like Nader was saying, that without the energy, we will not be able to attract other investments from other parts of the world, which might also include Japanese companies that today are looking for more energy resources in Egypt for them to be able to make that final leap. But the understanding is that there has to be a full holistic business environment that gives incentives for foreign direct investment to be able to do we like that?
Honestly speaking.
In what sense?
Do we lack providing the investors with the initiatives? Do we have too much red tape? Do we have too much bureaucracy? These are matters that need to be dealt with.
Look at your macroeconomic indicators. I mean, look at your position on the Global Competitiveness Index, on the Ease of Doing Business Index. Look at your universities and their lack of innovation. No. You rank 116, and that should be a basic shame on Egypt if we rank so low on a Global Competitiveness Index where Kazakhstan ranks better than we do in innovation and education, primary education, higher education, and the ease of doing business, markets efficiency, labor efficiency. All of these things are what we call the 12 pillars of competitiveness, right, if we review them. Now, the government, their 2030 strategy is also built on 12 pillars. Maybe not all of them are derived from the competitiveness index, but a majority of them, at least 8 of them, are derived from that index, because we are aware as a government that there has to be fundamental changes in these 12 pillars before we are able to become a country that, one, supports its internal and domestic markets, because if we start trying to attract foreign direct investment when we don't have the base, and the base here of economic growth has to come, one, from the private sector, two, it has to be built on small, medium enterprises, right, of which we are trying to address the problem for probably the 20th time in the past decade, with laws and regulations that finally don't see implementation on the ground. Right. And hence, the global community now is in a major competition. There is a slowdown in global economy, and as well, these developed nations have matured to a point of saturation in their own markets, right, and hence need to expand to different markets. And Africa is an untapped resource. Egypt is the gateway. It is the hub to the Middle East and to Africa, and hence it is a win-win situation for these countries to take advantage of Egypt's growth and development now, than to wait for a latter stage when Egypt has grown and it becomes more of a bigger market for them and more difficult market for them to enter.
Okay. Mr. Nader, if I come back to you, obviously we've seen and we've heard of a lot of investment opportunities here in Egypt, but again, as I mentioned earlier and as Mr. Ashraf mentioned, there remains a lot to be done in order for Egypt to be highly competitive. What do you think are the major stumbling blocks that we need to deal with at present?
This is a very hard question. Actually, this question should not be addressed to me. It should be addressed to two persons in the government. The first is the investment minister, and the second is a central bank governor.
Right.
As they are both are the people responsible for one for the regulation for entering and exiting the market, and the other is responsible for the monetary policy and handling the exchange rates and the transaction and the uses of proceeds coming into the government treasury due to taxes, due to tariffs, due to whatever fees to be paid to the government for establishing new investment or keeping an investment running. However, the current obstacles for investments in our economy, disregarding the FX change rate, right, because it's a major challenge for us due to structural deformations that happen due to some incidents during the past couple of months or half year, but we need to see what regulations do we need to straighten up to have more investments in Egypt. Of course, if we don't see the international direction or international heading during the coming period, we will not be able to keep up with the global growth trend.
Right.
Yesterday I was reading a report about the drop of oil prices and what it did in the thinking of transportation and vessel owning companies that should pass through Canal of Suez. Due to the drop of oil prices, many of the vessel owning companies, around 115,000 vessels, chose to go through the Head of Good Hope around the South African state,
right,
to go to India and Asia instead of going through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, due to the variation of cost for them after the oil prices have dropped. This have significantly hurted us.
Right.
After our opening for the new Suez Canal in past August, many vessels or many international business channels has stated that the revenues of Suez Canal revenues have dropped,
right,
in dollar terms. Why is that? Because many vessels, as I was saying, were rotating around the African continent instead of passing through the Mediterranean and Suez Canal. So this is a new direction, minimizing costs, keeping competitive. The report stated that if Egypt and Panama, because both channels were hurt badly, want to keep their competitiveness for these roads, they should consider cutting off their passing fees by 50%, at least.
Right.
So we have to keep competitive. We have to see where is the global growth is heading. The global growth is heading to Africa, to growing nations, to East Asia. So we are heading to these markets. But are we competitive enough?
Right.
So we need to see what could make us more competitive. In Africa, we have an advantage, being a hub, having 6 ports, having many airports. But yet, what are the legislations do we need to be an investment hub, spreading investments across the continent? This question was addressed in the Conference of Africa 2016, but yet there was no answer.
Right.
We need to know how could we fix, first of all, the entrance and exiting of foreign currency, having an easy way to enter it and exit it.
Right.
And second of all, having an easy way to enter and exit the Egyptian and the African market.
Okay, I'll just stop you there because we're going to take a quick break with our second report for the evening and a closer look at the recent decisions taken and the deals made by the Ministry of International Cooperation, and perhaps we'll be back to discuss that, so do stay with us.
Sahar Nasr announced that Egypt will hold an international conference in May for countries concerned with the implementation of development, in which different experiences and strategies for economic development will be showcased. Nasr's announcement came as the United Nations celebrated the 50th year of the United Nations for Development Project, the UNDP. The UNDP is considered a strategic partner for development in Egypt. According to Nasr, the country has made significant progress in various fields during the past period, such as improving citizens' standard of living. She added that the agenda is to establish a clear plan for development in order to accomplish sustainable growth. The minister invited the President of the Social and Economic Council, His Excellency John, who welcomed the invitation. The Council President praised Egypt's efforts so far to achieve economic development, adding that the country has the ability to overcome the challenges it faces. In earlier statements, the Minister of International Cooperation said that the ministry has coordinated with various financial institutions like the World Bank, the African Bank, and Islamic Development Bank to mobilize resources and technical assistance for important regional integration projects. She added that the ministry is working on drafting a number of integral initiatives to finance regional projects in the field of transport, energy and communications technology in Africa. Also, during her visit to China, Nasri represented Egypt at the opening session of launching the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, attended by the Chinese president. Nasri said that the bank in China is a strategic entity for the developing countries, including Egypt. She said that the bank is expected to provide funding ranges between $10 to $15 billion annually for various infrastructure projects over the coming 5 or 6 years in countries within its operations, including Egypt.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Ashraf, I'll come back to you perhaps. And how do you evaluate the performance of the Ministry of International Cooperation?
Can I talk about the whole government, not just the Ministry of International Cooperation? And let me not just talk about this government. Let me answer the question that you just asked, Nader, before we went out on a break. And what are some of the strongest, most hindering aspects that are keeping our economy from growing in Egypt, developing the right manner? And that is not just the government, but it's the whole administrative concept of what we have here. We have public and state companies.
Right.
We have very large inflated ministries. Okay, so if we're going to look at our administrative system that has a public servant ratio to citizen higher than that of China, okay, and that is one, we're talking about almost 7 million employees in the public sector. So here, before we start moving towards globalization, sustainability and development and competitiveness and all of that, we've really got to find a solution to one of the biggest problems, and that is that you have 7 million public servants.
Only 1 million of them are enough to keep the work going up.
Right.
And if we take that ratio and put it either on factories or we take it on ministries or administrative institutes or companies, the other thing is the role of the government itself, whether it's a large government or small government. So we agree that we don't need a large government. We need a much smaller, more efficient government with maybe 1 million people or so that will make things a little bit, I think, better. But then we have to always think of the social aspect of the other 6 million people, and we have to find a solution to them. There is no other alternative than downsizing the government. The other issue that we're faced with, and we have to look at other countries as examples, and how fast we have to take this specific pace of reform, and that is the role of the government as a participant within the market itself, within the business market itself.
Right.
While the role of the government needs to remain as a very, very strict regulator and enforcer of the market itself, it has taken upon itself a role where it competes with the private sector, competes with international investors, as a matter of fact. So you're trying to attract international investors, but you will compete with them as a government, not even as a private sector.
Yes.
And they're not doing a very good job of it. We don't have a very strong public sector that is competitive either domestically, regionally, or internationally.
Right.
We don't want to talk about a privatization program because we had a very bad experience with that here in Egypt pre-2011, but it's not a wrong thing to start re-revising again in our own localized approach to it.
Right.
The central bank, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, you'd know more than me on this thing. I don't think it's going through, but they were suggesting that maybe 10 public banks would be IPO'd on the stock exchange. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do, but for us, it gives us an indication that there is now a little bit more leeway within the government to understand that state assets, we have to start offsetting some of these state assets one way or the other. Now, another solution is to manage them efficiently ourselves.
Right.
For us to be able to have or re-revise a privatization program that would adjust the markets again, and that's what we need is a market adjustment.
Right.
For us to be able to do that, we have to have efficient state enterprises that are capable to be sold, that are viable to be sold to foreign investors. And hence, as management, we would have to take these decisions of letting go employees, becoming more efficient, really becoming more efficient enterprises. So that is one of the problems that we're facing. And no matter how much investment we try to bring into the country, post the infrastructure investments that the Egyptian government is already doing, there will be no proper economic future and development for Egypt unless you're able to balance that. Now, the second thing that we have to take a look at is what we call equality within society.
Right.
Now, the revolution in 2011 and as we moved on, sort of seemed to the rest of the world as a matter that was between the rich and the poor of Egypt, without taking into consideration that the middle class are really the basis and the cornerstone of any society and any nation. Yeah. So the problem isn't between rich and poor. We want the rich to be richer, we want the poor to become richer, and we want the middle class to expand. Now, our monetary policy, or our fiscal policy per se, has now been very much directed towards a very socialist approach to how we're going to develop our economy. In addition to some of the measures that we're taking, for example, that are impacting our premise within global trade, and that is increasing customs on what we call luxury items. Right. So here you are trying to tell the world that I'm open for global business. I want to be the hub for Africa, and I want to be that, a gateway to the Middle East, but at the same time I'm going to start implementing some really drastic measures on my trade and my customs. That comes at a time when your association agreement tariff dismantling schedule is now going into effect, right, which will allow European products into Egypt at zero customs. So now we're creating new customs to get away from the agreements that we have already signed. Right. And are now coming into effect almost after 17 or 18 years. Now, that being said, as economists that live in Egypt, not theoretically, we understand that there is a very major social aspect that we have to be very careful with. It was the reason behind the revolution in 2011, and that we have 48% of our population under the poverty line. So if I had a presidency or a leadership that was managing our economic reform program at a very fast pace, then that would have been a problem. Right. Despite the fact that that is the right thing to do, to move as fast as we possibly can, remove subsidies as fast as we possibly can, and really go into maybe a period of austerity measures that can rebalance what we're doing. But we have to take our pace of reform with this social aspect in mind as we move forward, but at the same time work on the other sides, which is the infrastructure, and that's what we need right now, is the infrastructure, the legislation that comes out from our supposedly new parliament, that will be able to create the environment that will eventually not, and always the focus of Egypt when we travel abroad or we go abroad, and that's some of the issues some countries have with us. This win-win situation isn't always the case. Right. We go and ask for investments, but very little investments. For example, Kazakhstan is a great country to invest in, but there weren't Egyptian businessmen. You didn't hear about any Egyptian investments within Kazakhstan itself during the visit. Okay, and that's not a win-win situation because they also have growth and they have employment and they need investments to be coming in. So we have to first saturate our local market, which we have a problem with. And that was part of the customs, increase in customs that they're doing. And that's supposed to give an incentive to local manufacturers to start improving their productivity and their quality and their efficiency, to be able not to export, but to be able to serve the local market and keep a little bit of the foreign reserves that we don't have very much of. But has this been tied with a strategic plan to really upgrade manufacturing? So you took a decision on increasing customs, but you have not set a clear strategy on how you're going to at least open the 4,000 or 5,000 factories that have been closed down since, I believe, 2011 or 2012. Right. So if it's not a cohesive strategy and approach where one part leads to the other, instead of the ad hoc attitude that we have from our government right now, where each ministry basically works as if it is a separate island in a separate country, and none of the performance of the government entities is actually in tune with the pace of what the presidency and the leadership is doing. Right. There is a mistranslation of the vision to a strategy.
Right. Do you agree, Mr. Gnadar, obviously, that we need to work, or that the government needs to work?
Completely.
Right.
Nothing can be said more, as Mr. Ashraf said. However, during the past 3 weeks, as I have been engaged into the conference of Africa 2016 and some other meetings and events, many investors are eyeing investment opportunities here in Egypt. Their main concern not only is the FX rates or the legislation or how would they transfer the returns, how would they deal with a government, the only person who's working in it is the president?
Right.
How would they deal with an administration? Each one is having the view of I'm always right. I think and I presume that the most idea that keeping the President Sisi popularity that high is he's keeping a simple old say of Arabs in his head.
Mm-hmm.
My opinion might be wrong, and your opinion might be right, and my opinion might be right, and your opinion might be wrong. What has been said by Imam al-Ghazali to Imam ibn Rushd 800 years ago or something.
Right.
So if we kept this in mind, the compromisation of opinions between each other, not being stiff for opinions, not being stiff for a word I have stated or I have written in the legislation, even in the parliament, everyone could go wrong.
Mm.
Everyone could go wrong. No one is mistake-free. We all are questionable in front of God. No one is mistake-free.
Right.
So we have to keep this in mind. An administration that having in mind that we are the right and you are the wrong will always go in fouls.
But an administration as well that, as we've said, that works out of pace with the presidency, again, that's going to always create a problem. We've got a 2030 strategy. How are we going to be able to achieve that if we continue at this particular pace?
We will be able to achieve that as the moment that we have a government or an administration that does not only execute what is being told to it. We would achieve that
right.
The moment that we would have a government that could innovate and find solutions out of the box for the obstacles it would find in their passes.
Okay.
Executing the targets it's being told, not the proceeds or the process that's being told.
Right.
Here in Egypt we have a government that you will not tell them where to go. They want you to tell them from where to go. There's a huge difference between two mentalities. The English say for the railway goes as the decision about the journey is not where it's not its destination.
Right.
It's the decision is the trip itself.
Right.
Here in Egypt, they want you to tell them what's the most safe trip so they could have it to the goal.
Right.
They don't want to experience the trip. This is what's creating our problem. This is what's making us not so competitive. This is what's making us so furious from investors. This is what's making us so lagging for governmental processing.
Well, I'm going to have to end it there, and I thank you very much for coming in, Mr. Ned Al-Khadri, economic analyst. Thank you very much for your time. Also, it was a pleasure having you, Mr. Ashraf Naguib, Secretary General of the Egyptian Asian Business Council. Thanks very much for coming in. And ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Debate. Do join us again tomorrow, same time, same place, here on Nile TV International. I'm Nancy Sarah Barakat, signing off. Thank you.